The chain was galvanized steel, thick as a man's thumb, bolted through the rotted planking at the base of an abandoned grain elevator 17 kilometers north of Leduc, Alberta. For the Belgian Malinois, trembling against the November wind that cut down from the foothills, the war had not ended in Kandahar. It had ended here, sold for $55 Canadian at a farm equipment auction outside Ponoka. His name was Rook. His military designation was W309, tattooed in faded green ink inside his right ear. He had completed 2 combat tours in Afghanistan alongside Canadian Forces personnel attached to a joint NATO task group, and he had spent 3 years before that learning to read the hidden language of the earth. The faint chemical whisper of buried pressure plates, the almost imperceptible shift in soil composition that told a trained nose where the ground would swallow a man alive. He had cleared forward operating bases in Panjwai and Jari districts. He had once stopped a patrol of 8 soldiers by planting himself in the path of their lead man, refusing to move, growling low and precise at nothing, until the combat engineers arrived and found 11 kilograms of homemade explosive packed beneath the dirt road. The soldiers had called him a ghost. His handler had simply called him Rook. His handler was Corporal Thea Callard, 26 years old at the time of her injury, a Canadian Forces military police dog handler from Petawawa, Ontario, embedded with a joint task group in Kandahar province. She was small for the role, 5'4", lean, with close-cropped dark hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that in certain environments, noise meant death. Her relationship with Rook had been built across 18 months of daily training before their first deployment, and it had the quality of deep, wordless understanding that develops between 2 living things who have spent enough time in danger together. They did not need commands most of the time. They had developed a private grammar of body language and breathing and the direction of a gaze. The IED detonated at 4:47 in the morning on a secondary road outside Massamgar. Thea had been walking point beside the vehicle column, with Rook working 6 meters ahead on an extending lead. The blast came from the culvert on the left side of the road, and the pressure wave hit her first, throwing her hard against the vehicle behind her. She remembered the heat. She remembered the sound, not loud, exactly, but total, a pressure that erased everything else. Then nothing, and then pain, and then a medevac helicopter, and then Germany. Rook was not injured. He had been far enough ahead on the lead that the blast threw him clear. He ran back to Thea's crumpled body and stayed there, flanking her head, facing outward until the rest of the patrol reached them. He did not bark. He simply held his position, body rigid, eyes scanning. He would not let anyone but the medic touch her. That was the last mission they ran together. Thea spent 11 months in rehabilitation, first at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, then at CFB Petawawa, then in the civilian world of physiotherapy appointments and the brutal grinding work of relearning what her left knee was supposed to do. Her L1 vertebra had a hairline compression fracture. Her left eardrum had healed imperfectly, leaving a high-frequency hearing loss she managed with a discreet hearing aid she almost never mentioned. She was 27 when they told her she would be medically released. She was 28 when the release became official. During those 11 months, Rook had been transferred. A civilian logistics manager at the Department of National Defense named Craig Stover had reviewed the working dog inventory during a budgetary reallocation exercise. Rook, assessed as physically sound, had been reclassified as an available asset and transferred to a contracted private security firm called Meridian Asset Protection Services, headquartered in Mississauga, Ontario. Meridian held a federal contract for port and facility security and used trained working dogs for cargo screening at 3 sites. Stover had signed the transfer paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not read Rook's service record. The field where a handler could claim first right of adoption had been left blank, not deliberately, but in the way bureaucratic neglect always operates, through the pure indifference of someone focused on columns and cost codes. Thea had filed the adoption paperwork from her hospital bed in Germany. She had filed it again from Petawawa. She had called the Working Dog Coordination Office 4 times and written 2 formal requests that went unanswered. She was told eventually, by a junior administrator who sounded apologetic and slightly baffled, that Rook had been transferred to a contracted partner organization and was no longer in the D&D working dog inventory. She asked for the organization's name. She was told that information was subject to a privacy provision in the contracting agreement. She hired a private paralegal. She filed 2 access to information requests. One was denied. The other returned 6 months later with 17 pages, 11 of which were entirely redacted. Rook served with Meridian for 14 months. He worked the overnight cargo screening shift at a port facility in Hamilton. Long hours, damp concrete, the mechanical smell of shipping containers, the utter absence of the high-altitude wind and the vast Afghan sky that had been the atmosphere of his working life. Belgian Malinois are not built for idleness. They are built for purpose. When the purpose contracts to the same circuit, walked the same way in the same dark, something begins to go wrong in them, not in their hearts, which remain enormous and loyal past all reason, but in their bodies, which begin to absorb the lack of real work as a kind of slow physical grief. Rook developed hip dysplasia in his right rear joint at the age of 6. It was not unexpected for a working dog of his operational history, but Meridian Asset Protection Services had a performance matrix, and a dog who limped during the 3rd hour of a shift was a dog who could no longer justify his maintenance cost. He was quietly retired from active duty, reclassified in the company's asset management system as surplus, and entered into a general surplus auction held at a livestock and equipment facility outside Ponoka, Alberta. A man named Harv Pelton had bid $55. Harv ran a property north of Leduc that functioned, on paper, as a small engine repair and agricultural salvage operation. In practice, his acreage held several pieces of farm equipment, 2 ATVs, a side-by-side, and a John Deere tractor, whose serial numbers had been ground down to unreadable. Harv wanted a guard dog, and he wanted one cheap. He drove Rook back to Leduc County in the bed of a half-ton and chained him to the base of the old grain elevator on the far corner of the property. The chain was 12 feet long. The water dish was an upturned hubcap. The food was intermittent. By November, the temperature at night dropped to -19 Celsius, and the Alberta wind made it feel worse. Rook pressed himself against the base of the elevator, using the warped wooden boards as a windbreak, and waited. He was still a working dog. He still scanned the tree line at the property's edge with the same methodical sweep he had used over the compounds of Kandahar. He still tracked every sound, every shift in wind direction. He had not stopped being what he was trained to be. He was simply doing it in the dark, alone, for no one. Inside his right ear, beneath the grime and the cold, the tattoo W309 was still legible if you knew to look. 340 kilometers south, in an apartment near White Avenue in Edmonton, Thea Callard was awake at 1:30 in the morning, which was not unusual. She was 29 now. She worked part-time as a civilian instructor at an RCMP dog handler training program out of the Sherwood Park detachment, a job she had found partly through a veterans' employment placement office and partly through sheer persistence. She was good at it. The RCMP handlers respected her, and the dogs, without exception, read her correctly from the first day. She lived alone. She ran every morning despite the knee, which ached in the cold in a way that no amount of physiotherapy had fully resolved. She had 2 photographs on her refrigerator, one of her unit on the tarmac at CFB Trenton before their second deployment, and one of herself and Rook, taken at Kandahar airfield, her arm around his shoulders, both of them looking off to the left at something outside the frame. She had never stopped looking for him. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table. She was in the middle of her nightly scan of the working dog rescue and sighting groups on Facebook when the post appeared, shared from a group called Prairie Working Dog Watch, originally posted by someone named Gareth Kowalczyk, who identified himself as a long-haul driver running the Queen Elizabeth II corridor. He had stopped to check his load at a pull-off north of Leduc and spotted a dog through a property fence from the highway. He had taken 3 photos through the truck window. The caption read, "Spotted this dog chained to an old elevator north of Leduc off QEI. Looked like a working breed, Malinois maybe. Thin as hell, whined going right through him. Tried honking, and the owner came out and told me to move on. Dog had what looked like a tattoo in his ear and a scar on his left shoulder. Anyone in that area?" Thea clicked the photos. The first 2 were blurry, taken at distance through a wire fence. But the third, Gareth had managed to zoom in, and the autofocus had caught for just a moment, showed the dog's profile, the wide skull, the tuck of the hip, the way his right rear leg shifted its weight fractionally off the ground, the dark marking that ran from the point of the left shoulder down through the coat. Thea stopped breathing. She had put that scar there herself. Not intentionally. Rook had caught a piece of wire from a demolished compound gate during a building clearance in their second deployment, and she had sutured it closed in the field with what she had in her kit. The scar had stayed. The conditions hadn't allowed for anything better. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Fletcher Crane. Fletcher was a former CF combat engineer who had served on the same task group, though in a different role. He lived in Calgary and worked in industrial demolition, and he picked up on the second ring despite the hour, the way people do when the kind of thing they've been through rewires how you sleep. "I found him," Thea said. "I found Rook." A silence then. "Where?" She told him. She sent him the photos while they were still on the call. She heard him exhale sharply at the third image. "Give me 20 minutes, Fletcher said. "I'm calling Tobias and Jonas." Tobias Aldred was a former Canadian Forces medic, who now worked as a paramedic out of Red Deer. Jonas Pratt had been a military working dog handler himself before his release, and he now ran a small kennel operation out of Lethbridge. When Fletcher reached them within the hour, neither one hesitated for a second. "This isn't exactly inside the lines," Thea said, when the 4 of them were on a call together just past 2 a.m. "Harv Pelton bought him legally. Technically under property law, we'd be—" "Thea," Jonas said quietly, "stop talking." 12 minutes later, they had a plan. They agreed to meet at the Tim Hortons off the Leduc overpass at 4:15 in the morning. Fletcher drove up from Calgary, making the 3-hour drive in just over 2.5. Tobias drove south from Red Deer. Jonas came up from Lethbridge and was the last to arrive, parking his truck beside Thea's at 4:22. They sat in the far corner with coffees they barely touched, and a satellite image Jonas had pulled from Google Maps, printed at a 24-hour FedEx in Lethbridge before he left. The Pelton property covered approximately 80 acres. The farmhouse sat near the south entrance off the county road. The grain elevator stood at the northeast corner, 380 meters from the house. Between them, an equipment yard, a pole barn, and dense stands of white spruce that would provide cover. "I drive past that property on the highway run twice a week," Fletcher said, tracing the satellite image with his thumb. "Harv's usually inside by 10. He's got 1 farmhand, sleeps in the bunkhouse on the south side of the yard." "Lights on the elevator?" Jonas asked. "1 security light on the east face, motion activated." "We avoid the east face entirely," Thea said. "Come in from the northwest through the spruce. There's a wire fence on the north perimeter. Standard agricultural wire, no barbs. Fletcher, you're through it in under a minute." Fletcher nodded. "Tobias," she continued, "you stay back on the north perimeter with the truck. Engine off, lights off. You watch the farmhouse. Any movement, you call it." "And if Pelton comes out?" Tobias asked quietly. Thea looked at him. "We stop. We talk. We don't run. We have nothing to hide except being on his property at 4 in the morning, which is going to be a difficult conversation, but not an impossible one." She paused. "But we are not leaving without Rook." At 5:10 in the morning, the two vehicles rolled off the county road with their headlights killed, moving slowly along the frozen track at the property's north edge. They parked behind a line of spruce, 60 meters back from the fence line. The temperature was -17°C. The sky was enormous and perfectly clear, the kind of Alberta winter sky that holds stars from horizon to horizon, and the frozen ground gave off a faint blue-white luminescence in the starlight that was almost beautiful. Thea pulled a balaclava down over her face and pulled on insulated gloves. She could see her breath fogging and disappearing in front of her. Fletcher cut the fence in 4 places and peeled it back cleanly without a sound. They moved through the gap single file. Thea first, then Jonas, then Fletcher covering the rear. The spruce thinned as they approached the elevator yard, giving way to open ground. Thea stopped at the tree line, took a slow breath and studied the northeast corner of the property through the dark. The grain elevator stood perhaps 40 meters ahead. Old, built sometime in the 60s, boards grey and warped, the metal cap on the headhouse dull with rust. Against its northwest space, just barely visible in the ambient light from the distant highway, was a shape on the ground. A dog, curled tight, small-looking in the cold. Thea moved without speaking. She crossed the open ground at a slow, deliberate pace, not creeping, not rushing, the kind of steady walk that says, "I belong here, I have every right to be here, I am not afraid." 20 meters out. Then 15, then 10. At 8 meters, the dog's head came up. He did not bark. He issued a single low sound, not quite a growl. More of a warning, a controlled declaration. His eyes caught the faint ambient light and held it. Thea stopped. She went down on one knee in the frozen dirt. She took off her right glove and tucked it into her jacket pocket, exposing her bare hand to the -17 air. She extended it, palm flat, angled slightly downward. She kept her eyes on his, direct but not aggressive. "Rook," she said, very quietly. Not a command, just his name. In the exact register she had always used when they were done with the mission and the pressure was off, when they were back inside the wire, and the night belonged to them. The sound of it hit the dog in a way that was not quite hearing. It landed somewhere below cognition, somewhere older. His body shifted. The controlled warning in his throat broke apart and became something else entirely. A sharp inhale, a huff of expelled breath, a sound that had no clean description except that it was the sound of recognition after a very long absence. Rook got to his feet. His right rear hip was wrong. The movement showed it immediately, a slight hitch, a compensation, but he came forward anyway, pulling the chain taut, and when he reached the limit of its reach he pushed against it with his whole body, straining toward her. Thea crossed the remaining distance on her knees. She put both arms around him. He was all ribs and cold fur, trembling steadily. His tongue found the side of her face, her ear, the line of her jaw. He made sounds she had never heard him make before, low, broken sounds, the sounds of a dog who had stopped expecting anything and been given back the one thing he'd stopped expecting. She pressed her face into his neck and did not say anything coherent for a long time. Just his name. Just "I've got you." Just "You held the line. You're done now. I've got you." Jonas was already beside her with the bolt cutters. He looked at her once, brief and complete, and then placed the jaws of the cutters around the padlock, securing the chain, and cut it. The chain dropped. Rook shook his head once, startled by the sudden absence of weight. He pressed himself harder against Thea's chest. It was Fletcher who heard the porch door. "We've got movement," Tobias said through the earpiece at almost the same instant. The farmyard lights came on, 2 banks of LED floods mounted on the elevator's south face, triggered by the motion sensor they had been careful to avoid, now catching them from the side. The light was violent in its suddenness. Thea stood up, shielding her eyes with her forearm. Harve Pelton crossed the yard in heavy sorrel boots and a down-filled hunting coat, a Remington bolt-action rifle held in his left hand, muzzle down. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the offended authority of a man on his own land who has been woken up angry. Behind him, his farmhand, a large man who would later confirm his name as Dale, followed with a steel-handled shovel resting across his shoulder. "Don't you move," Harve said, pulling up short when he saw how many of them there were. His eyes moved from Thea to Jonas to Fletcher and back again. "This is private property. I will call the RCMP right now." "Mr. Pelton," Thea said. Her voice was completely even. Her hands were at her sides. "Please do. We'll all wait together." The response stopped him. "That dog is mine," he said louder now. "I bought him at a legal auction. You've got no right to be on my land." "His name is Rook," Thea said. "His military designation is W309. He completed 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan with Canadian forces. He has an adoption claim on file with the Department of National Defense dating back 4 years that was never honored due to an administrative error in the working dog transfer protocol. He belongs with his handler." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'm his handler." Harve's jaw tightened. "I don't care about any of that. He's my property." From behind a rusted hay rake to Harve's left, Fletcher Crane stepped out of the shadow. Not rushing, just moving into the light with the ease of someone comfortable being the least concerned person in any given situation. "Mr. Pelton," Thea said, pulling a white envelope from her inner jacket pocket. "There is $500 in this envelope. That is a considerably more than fair return on your $55 investment." She set it on the hood of a rusted half-ton nearby. "Take it." She let a moment pass. "And while you're deciding, I want to mention that Jonas here spent 8 years as a working dog handler and knows exactly what a military service tattoo looks like inside a dog's ear. He also knows what a VIN ground to nothing looks like on a piece of farm equipment." She kept her voice level, almost conversational. "He counted 4 such pieces in your equipment yard on the drive past." The rifle muzzle dropped another inch. Harve looked at the envelope. He looked at the 4 of them standing in the light. A long silence. "Take the damn dog," he finally said, turning his back, "and get off my property." Thea turned back to Rook. He was standing at her heel, watching Harve with working dog focus perfectly still. She put her hand on his neck, and he leaned into it with his full weight. "Let's go home," she said quietly. The drive back to Edmonton was quiet in the way that follows the end of something very long. Rook lay on a folded blanket in the cargo area of Thea's SUV, his head resting on her thigh. Tobias worked in the cramped space, with the focused economy of a man used to treating patients in moving vehicles. He placed an IV line and ran warm saline. He wrapped Rook in a thermal blanket and monitored his core temperature with steady, professional calm, reporting numbers without drama. "His hip is inflamed but structurally intact," Tobias said, palpating carefully along the joint. "He's malnourished and his core temp is low, nothing that time and proper care won't fix. His heart rate is steady and strong." He paused. "He's still in there, all of him." Almost immediately, as the warm fluids began to move through him, Rook let out a long, shuddering exhale. The rigid tension that had held his muscles through 2 Alberta winters of cold and hunger and waiting slowly finally left him. He pressed his muzzle deep against Thea's leg and closed his eyes, falling into the first unguarded sleep he had known in years. Thea watched the highway lights slide past on the window glass. The QEI stretched north toward the city, and the stars outside were enormous, and beside her Rook breathed with the slow, even rhythm of a dog who had finally stopped standing guard. Back in Edmonton, Thea contacted a veterans' rights lawyer named Marguerite Dufour, who practiced out of Ottawa and had spent 15 years specializing in D&D policy and Canadian Forces service member advocacy. When Marguerite heard the full account, from the Kandahar IED to the administrative transfer, from the Ponoka auction to the Leduc grain elevator, she said, "Send me everything you have." 4 years of access to information responses, the original adoption requests filed from Germany and from Petawawa, the photographs Jonas had taken in Half Pelton's yard, Rook's ribs casting shadows under the LED floods, Tobias's written clinical assessment, all of it. "Give me 72 hours, Marguerite said. She did not need 72 hours, she needed 48. Marguerite Dufour was not a person who moved slowly when she was angry, and she was, by any measure, very angry. She placed the story with a CBC journalist who covered national defense and veterans affairs, and the piece ran on CBC News Network 3 days after the Leduc extraction, with the photographs, with Thea's name and service record, with a photograph of Rook in his working harness at Kandahar airfield, and with a statement from Marguerite outlining in precise, unflinching language the chain of administrative failure that had left a decorated military working dog shackled to a grain elevator in -19-degree weather for the cost of a tank of gas. The public response was not gradual. It was immediate and enormous in the way that stories about the institutional betrayal of loyalty tend to be. The CBC piece was shared more than 47,000 times in the first 18 hours. The DND received over 12,000 emails in 48 hours. The Minister of National Defence's office fielded calls for 4 straight days. 3 opposition MPs issued statements. The Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs called a special session and invited Craig Stover to appear and explain, on the public record, the administrative process by which military working dog W309 had been transferred to a private contractor without resolution of an existing handler adoption claim. Stover appeared before the committee on a Tuesday. He was not, by any account, comfortable. Meridian Asset Protection Services issued a statement confirming they had been unaware of the unresolved adoption claim at the time of their acquisition. Marguerite described this statement publicly as technically possibly accurate and entirely beside the point. DND's legal review concluded within 3 weeks. Rook's transfer was found to have bypassed the mandatory handler notification protocol established in the Working Dog Management Directive. Stover was moved to a non-supervisory administrative role in a different directorate. DND retroactively approved Thea's original adoption application, backdating it to her first submission 4 years earlier. Rook was officially classified as a retired military working dog, honorably discharged, with a service record that included citation for his actions during the IED incident outside Masamgar. A small ceremony was held at CFB Edmonton. A base commander who had served in Afghanistan shook Thea's hand for a long time without saying a word, which said everything that needed to be said. A year later, on a cold but bright Sunday in February, Thea Callard threw a tennis ball across the snow-covered field at Horalac Park, and Rook went after it at a pace that accounted for his hip, but did not much apologize for it. His coat had filled out through the winter, thick and double-layered against the cold, and he had gained 11 kilograms since Leduc. He ran on 3.5 legs when he ran hard, his right rear a fraction slow, but the joy in the run was total and unqualified, a thing that could not be diminished by bureaucratic neglect or Alberta winters or the passage of 4 lost years. He caught the ball at the edge of a snowdrift, turned, and came back to Thea at a controlled lope. He dropped it at her feet and sat at perfect attention, his amber eyes locking onto her face, waiting for whatever came next. Thea looked at him for a moment before she picked it up. He still wore his collar with the DND service tag, small, matte stamped W309. It clinked softly against the dog tag she had added, her own regimental ones from Petawawa, the ones she had worn in Afghanistan. She had put them on him the morning they came home from the veterinary clinic, during his first full night under a roof and beside a radiator, and next to a person he trusted completely. He hadn't left her side since. "Good boy," Thea said. She put her bare hand on his head, the cold biting at her fingers, and he leaned into the touch with his full weight the way he always had, fully, without reservation, the way dogs give their loyalty when they have decided it is yours to keep. She threw the ball again. He went. Loyalty, once given by a dog, does not expire. It does not check for reciprocation. It does not require explanation or reward. It simply holds, through the deployment and the medevac, through the chain and the cold and the long silence, through every day that passed without a familiar scent on the wind. Rook had spent 4 years waiting for Thea Callard, not because he understood the contracting maze that had kept them apart, but because he had decided, somewhere in their 18 months of training and their 2 years in the field, that she was the person he had been made to find. The system had failed them both. The paperwork had failed them. The contracting chain had failed them, and the audit process had failed them. And the mid-level manager in Mississauga, who had not read a service record on a Tuesday afternoon, had failed them in a way that cost 4 years and nearly cost everything. But the people who had shown up at a Tim Hortons at 4:15 in the morning had not. And neither in the end had Rook.